Hello folks, and welcome to Saving Miller. So in the last video we talked a little bit about the concerns that we're experiencing globally about food and food control and what various governments are doing. And here in the US we have a unique situation that's probably similar in other countries as well. But I have an idea. So we know that homesteaders and small farmers can have a huge impact if there's enough of them. So this country used to have millions of homesteaders, people with small plots of land like ours. They had goats, they had a couple of cows, chickens, maybe some ducks, and definitely a turkey or two. And they produced their own food and they sold the excess to their friends and neighbors, to people in the community, maybe to a local grocery store. However, it was considered, and this is bizarre to me today looking back on it, but it was considered a hardship and bondage because many of these homesteaders essentially lived below the poverty line. Now that's understandable, you know, they had very few resources, but they were actually in control of their own food supply, and they knew this, and so a lot of them didn't really have a problem with it, I don't think. However, as the industrial machine began to ramp up and manufacturing jobs became available, suddenly going to work in a factory and buying your food at the grocery store seemed like a much better option. And I can understand that, because growing your own food is actually a lot of work. It's very difficult, it's very challenging, even on a good day. You know, right now we're still in high temperatures. It cooled off kind of nicely right now, but it was 107 here today. And so there's a lot of challenges associated with growing your own food, and especially if we were producing vegetables. So we're producing mostly meat because it works well for us, and we can do it fairly efficiently, so it doesn't take a lot of our time. However, if we were traditional homesteaders, we would also produce a lot of vegetables, and we would can and we would preserve things and make so that we have food to get through the winter and so forth. So what has happened over time is that we can no longer legally produce a lot of products and sell them to people. For instance, in many states, and I don't know the specifics about where we are because I haven't really tried to do it or looked into it, but in most states it is illegal for a farmer to harvest and process their own poultry on their own farm and sell it to someone. They must take it to an independent USDA certified shop in order to sell it. Now, this just blows my mind. You know, it doesn't matter whether the farmer is competent or not, whether they have a state-of-the-art butcher shop, they're not allowed to do this. And so going from farm to table directly like we should be doing is illegal in many situations. The same is true for beef. You know, it has to go through a USDA certified facility in order to sell to a consumer. You know, so you can't come and buy hamburger from us because we can't sell it to you. Even we can produce it, but we can't sell it to you. So this is a very frustrating thing. There's a number of laws like this that are on the books that make it very difficult for homesteaders to be a significant part of the food supply chain. Even though we are the most efficient, we are the closest, we are the smallest carbon footprint available. You know, our carbon footprint is incredibly small when it comes to the meat that we produce. And yet, it's with all the talk about climate change and how we should be more efficient, instead they're making laws and passing regulations that make it even more difficult to produce food and get it to a consumer in a sustainable kind of way. So you could really sum it up like this. In many ways, sustainable agriculture is almost illegal. It's stupid. It really is. Now, originally, many of the USDA regulations, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, many of those regulations were initially created for public health, for the sake of the consumer. And the reason is because a lot of people were getting sick from poor quality foods, right? They were contaminated with various germs and various bacteria that made people sick. It makes a lot of sense, right? Well, the reason that this was happening is because people didn't know. there was just ignorance. They didn't realize what the problem was. They didn't realize how people were getting sick. And so in order to combat this, the governing agencies passed these laws that essentially cover the whole United States and made it very difficult for people to produce their food and legally sell it to their neighbor. So now today we know better. We have good handling practices. We understand how to make these things work, but it's still illegal. And here's the reason that this has not changed. So laws in Washington, especially, not so much with state laws, but especially for federal laws in the United States, they are created and passed by Congress under the influence of corporate demands, right? So corporations say, we need this law to look like this and like this and like this. That's what we want to see. And the way that they accomplish this is by paying lobbyists who have relationships with the publicly elected officials. And these lobbyists court the publicly elected officials. They take them on ski trips. They take them out to nice restaurants for nice dinners and things like that. Not necessarily nefarious in and of itself, but that's what happens. So the laws and the regulations that are created are almost always, maybe without exception, created in the interest of a corporation that is saying, hey, we would like this, or we would like that, and we would like that banned. You know, maybe Tyson Foods is behind the current ban on the sale of meat from a farm, because they would like to be able to control that. Corporations essentially can have a monopoly. And so I believe I've talked about this before, but there's not many sources of food. If you look at the corporate structures, there's only about 4 meat producers. There's JBS, I may have that one wrong, but there's Tyson Foods and a couple of others. So most of the meat in grocery stores, the vast majority of it comes from 4 producers in the U.S. And they source their meat from the U.S. They also source it from Brazil and other places. So just because they're U.S. corporations doesn't mean they have a great supply chain. It just means that they're producing it for a fairly low cost. And so all of this, you know, they have lobbyists to represent them. We don't. Where is the lobbyist that is representing a homesteader? Where is Justin Rhodes' lobbyist who's in Washington saying, hey, let's change this regulation so that they can, you know, accomplish this? Or let's change this regulation so that homesteaders who have a much smaller carbon footprint than the big producers can produce food and farm in a sustainable way and reduce the impact on the environment. All of this nonsense about climate change and the regulations that are getting passed are largely hypocritical, almost entirely hypocritical. First of all, they are not actually accomplishing what they claim they're accomplishing, you know, by passing things about emissions and all of that. And one good example, think about this. So if you have a diesel engine, you now have to buy a product called diesel exhaust fluid. It's nothing but urea. It costs more than diesel or gasoline. It's ridiculously expensive and crazy cheap to produce. But if you have a newer tractor, a larger tractor, bigger than ours, you have to have this product to put into this tractor. And it comes in a plastic bottle in a cardboard box. And the waste that is generated by this is enormous. There are millions of trucks and tractors on the road that need this product, and all of this waste is going into landfills. It's produced, think about it, plastics, yes, it's produced by oil. So by using some oil over here, and we are essentially reducing our carbon footprint by, you know, reducing the amount of soot that goes into the atmosphere. That's the claim anyway. Well, that soot eventually ends up in a landfill, which, yeah, maybe that's okay. But if it stays stuck in the filters and the exhaust system, it still exists somewhere. It doesn't go away. That carbon is still somewhere. It's either in the atmosphere or in the filter. It doesn't disappear even though you have the DEF. So all these regulations are largely a farce, something to make the environmentalists feel better about things and make people think that they're doing something good for the environment. And these things occur because industry constantly is coming up with ways to circumvent the actual goal so that they can continue making a profit for their shareholders. And like I said, they do this, they accomplish this through the lobbyists. So I think it's time for homesteaders and small farmers who don't have a voice right now, right? I have no voice in Washington. Nobody's listening to me. And there's thousands of other people like me. Nobody's listening to Justin Rhodes in the same way. I mean, in Washington, D.C., the same is true for Joel Salatin. Like, he's a much larger operation, produces a tremendous amount of food, and there are constantly regulations that he has to deal with that are just stupid. Like, they don't accomplish anything positive, and they restrict the actual quality production of high-quality foods. So I think it's time that we find a way to come up with a lobbyist group in Washington that can advocate for sustainable agriculture, regenerative farming. Somehow we've got to accomplish this. And I don't have the answer. I'm identifying the problem. But I think if enough of us get together, we could actually accomplish this and make a positive change, at least in our country. And I know the similar structures exist in other countries. Canada needs help. They're in trouble. Like, their agriculture production is in big time trouble. It's the things that are happening across the world with relation to the food supply just blow my mind. But always remember, this is about control. And when we understand how the system works, we can affect change that is positive, that takes care of our communities, instead of just blindly sitting back and allowing the destruction to continue. So that's my idea. Those are my thoughts for right now. I wanted to share this with you. I've been thinking about it a lot. Like, we need a homesteader lobbyist in Washington to protect our interests. And in a sense, I mean, really defend the American values that we have of being able to produce our own food and be able to supply food to our neighbors. So let me know what you think. Let me know in the comments. I'd really like to hear from you guys and see what you think about this. And maybe somebody has a good idea, some way to actually make this happen. So that's what I've got for you this week. Saving Miller out.